Oh, there you go. Okay. So, welcome to all the brave hearts that came out all masked. And can you hear me? Okay. You cannot hear me? Oh, you want me to take my mask off? I don't really like taking my mask off these days. So here we are. I hope we're streaming live, and that many of the people who feel a little uncomfortable being here live today are going to be able to enjoy Sky's talk. And for next week, Richard Scorman has informed me that he's going to postpone due to COVID risks. And so we will reschedule him as soon as he feels everything is safe. So boo-hoo, and I'm not sure if we will skip next week or figure something out. So watch the emails, especially later in the week. What else is there? I think that's about it. And we'll let Sky get started now for today.
Morning. Before I get started, since today is a day to celebrate Dell, I thought I would share a story. Janet and I were visiting with Bazgul and Latif and the family earlier this week, and Dell, as you know, the Sunday school kids have been making little lunch boxes full of gifts for each of the Afghan children with their names and so on. And so Dell wanted to deliver to Bazgul's family, so we went over with her to do that and introduce Dell to her. And I just wanted to point out, it was wonderful. The kids loved all the toys in the boxes and were really impressed by the special care. But the timing was perfect because that very day they had registered Faizan and Alia, the two older children who were 9 and 6, for school. And they were, in fact, starting school the very next day. So the lunch boxes were perfect. So hats off to Dell. By the way, I did bring my hat for Dell today. So anyway. Well, thank you all for being here. This is a lot more people than I expected to be here, given the lovely weather we're having outside. And as I said to somebody earlier, if it weren't for the fact that I was giving the talk, I might not be here. When Ardith asked me if I could fill in at the forum, she said, could you come talk on January 6th? And I said, well, the date dictates the topic. Actually, it's January 9th. And she said, well, actually, yeah, but it's the same week. But so here I am. This is not one of my usual talks about world affairs with slides and maps and things like that. This, for me, is very personal. It's a volatile subject. And this forum demands a nonpartisan approach. Personally, I'm not affiliated with any political party, and I trust that nothing that I say today will be read as a criticism or endorsement of any political party. That's my definition of nonpartisan. Nonpartisan doesn't mean you don't have an opinion. I wrote an op-ed in the Gazette a year ago in which I declared January 6th as a new day of infamy. And I'm grateful that Emily published that editorial alongside Thursday's Just Peace e-blast. In the e-blast, I did not want to get into my own views on January 6th, but simply to assert that given our 2017 Just Peace Declaration, the continuing assault on voting rights and election integrity should be part of that foundation. We are a nation of laws that can either reinforce peace building and social justice or destroy them. And it is through elections that we determine who makes those laws. And I, for one, would prefer to effect positive change through elections and law rather than taking to the streets to fight a corrupt system. The former is what these United States is supposed to be about. The latter is what is taking place today in the streets of Kazakhstan, in Russia, Hong Kong, Nicaragua, and elsewhere. But I want to be careful and clear about my message today. So I've done something I rarely do. which is actually to write down what I have to say. So forgive me if I appear to be reading, because that's exactly what I'm doing. But the good news is that if somebody really, really wants this, I'm happy to send it to you. If you send me an email, I'll send you the text. As the late Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan so aptly said almost 40 years ago, everyone is entitled to his opinion, but not his own facts. I will try and stick to facts and let facts speak for themselves. My focus will be less on what happened on January 6, 2021, but what has and has not happened since, and the implications for our democracy. So let me summarize my argument up front. 5 points, after that you can go to sleep. First, what started as a reasonably broad bipartisan consensus condemning the events and perpetrators on January 6th has evolved remarkably into dueling narratives about what happened that day, who was responsible, and what it means. And that's dangerous. Second, one of those dueling narratives perpetuates the notion that the 2020 election was stolen from Donald Trump. This narrative is providing the cover for a systematic effort on the part of many state governments to impede access to the ballot box, and in some cases to empower partisan officials to overturn the results of elections they don't like. This is unfortunately not a new or unique phenomenon in American history, but it is no less injurious to democracy. Third, American democracy, the kind framed by James Madison and the other founders, requires that we must be able to hold those in power accountable for what they do, and this requires transparency in the exercise of power. When we structurally tilt the scales of power to one side, transparency disappears, and accountability becomes difficult, if not impossible. Fourth, as Sergej Popovich reminded us at the forum in mid-November, there can be no democracy without a center. Polarized narratives and the rarity of civic discourse is eroding the center in American politics. And finally, if we think this is an academic subject far removed from our daily lives and our ability to make a difference, we are mistaken. It was always the case that democracy, with all its warts and foibles, needed to be proactively exercised at the grassroots. The alternative is the kind of creeping authoritarianism we find throughout the world today. Power, legitimized by elections that are structured so that the outcome of those elections is irrelevant. So that's what this is about. Let me begin by reading a couple of statements that may surprise you. You may have heard them before, you may not. Quote, "Last week's violent attack on the Capitol was undemocratic, un-American, and criminal. The president bears responsibility for Wednesday's attack on Congress by mob rioters. He should have immediately denounced the mob when he saw what was unfolding. These facts require immediate action by President Trump. Accept his share of responsibility, quell the brewing unrest, ensure President-elect Biden is able to successfully begin his term. The president's immediate action also deserves congressional action, which is why I think a fact-finding commission and censure resolution would be prudent." End quote. January 13th, 2021. The next quote was a month later, February 13th, 2021. Quote, "January 6th was a disgrace. American citizens attacked their own government. They used terrorism to try and stop a specific piece of domestic business they did not like. These fellow Americans bloodied our own police. They stormed the Senate floor. They tried to hunt down the Speaker of the House. They built a gallows and chanted about murdering the Vice President. They did this because they had been fed wild falsehoods by the most powerful man on earth. He was angry because he lost an election. President Trump's actions preceding the riots were a disgraceful dereliction of duty. There is no question. President Trump is more practically and morally responsible for provoking the events of that day. There is no question about it. The people who stormed this building believed they were acting on the wishes and instructions of their president. And having that belief was a foreseeable consequence of the growing crescendo of false statements, conspiracy theories, and reckless hyperbole, which the defeated president kept shouting into the largest megaphones on planet Earth. Wow, end quote. Anybody recognize those? The first was by House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy. The second by Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell. My point in reciting these statements is twofold. First, I don't need to tell you what happened that day. They did a pretty darn good job of it. The more important point, however, is that 1 year later, neither of these congressional leaders has acted on any of these sentiments. There was no censure passed by the Congress. There was impeachment, but no conviction. No invoking of the 14th Amendment to prohibit Trump's ability to run for federal office again. The Senate Majority Leader blocked consideration of a January 6th joint commission of the two houses. The House Minority Leader blocked Republican participation on the House's January 6th Select Committee and has since refused to appear before that committee, even though he was on the phone to President Trump several times during that day. Of the two Republican members of Congress who chose to participate in the committee, on the January 6th committee, Liz Cheney of Wyoming was stripped of her leadership role within the House Republican caucus, and her own party is campaigning against her re-election. Adam Kinzinger of Illinois has opted to retire from Congress amid death threats. Of the other 8 Republicans in Congress who voted to impeach Trump for inciting an insurrection on January 6th, 1 additional House member has opted to retire. There are 3 facing Trump-endorsed primary challenges, and 4 have been effectively silenced within the caucus. One more statement closer to home. Quote, "The most powerful man in the world, a billionaire who controls a nuclear arsenal and an unfathomable amount of government cash, intentionally inspired criminal acts by an angry mob. This is now the indelible legacy of Donald J. Trump and an embarrassing blemish on our country's global reputation." Anybody recognize that? The editorial board of the Colorado Springs Gazette on January 8th, 2021. But as for the Gazette, there has since then been news coverage of various developments over the past year. A few conservative columnists criticizing the January 6th Commission or equating January 6th to left-wing race protests, but no editorial comment about the need for accountability for inspiring what they called criminal acts by an angry mob. Did these events not happen? Have we forgotten? Where are we now? First, there has been some accountability for the events of January 6th, but really only on the part of those who were in the Capitol itself. So far, as tallied by the Washington Post this past week, 701 have been charged, 367 of those to at least one felony, the other half, approximately a half, misdemeanors only. 174 have pled guilty, 24 felony cases, 150 misdemeanors. 74 have been sentenced, 7 for felonies, 67 for misdemeanors. 35 have received jail time, but 25 of those for 2 months or less. 14 home detention, 25 sentenced to probation. 527 cases remain. Almost 2/3 of those are felony cases. It's slow going. And to many, including me, somewhat underwhelming. What remains beyond these cases is whether others who were involved in planning or actively encouraging these actions will ever be held accountable. But at least as important as accountability for those involved is the growing political reality that a set of totally divergent narratives about what happened in 2020 has emerged. Notwithstanding Mitch McConnell's characterization of, quote, false statements, conspiracy theories, and reckless hyperbole, according to a Washington Post University of Maryland poll taken in mid-December, only 27% of Republicans believe that Trump bears a great deal or a good amount of blame for the attack. 27%. For Democrats, that number is 92%. For independents, it's 57%. Overall, it's 60%. Strongly correlating with these statements, 68%, I know there's a lot of numbers here, 68% of Americans agree there is no solid evidence of widespread fraud in the 2020 election. 88% of Democrats believe that, 74% of independents believe that. But 62% of Republicans believe there is such evidence of fraud. And that belief has held steady throughout 2021. Even though every one of the 63 lawsuits that have been posted contesting the 2020 election have failed, thrown out as frivolous lawsuits and lack of evidence. Now, former Trump campaign lawyers that brought those suits are being sued, but those cases remain to be determined. Beyond the question of lawsuits and countersuits, the broader question is the impact on one's faith in elections. According to that same mid-December poll, almost 30% of Americans believe that President Biden's election was not legitimate, including 58% of Republicans and 27% of independents. To be fair, there has been some improvement on that score. After the January 6th attack, a similar poll showed 70% of Republicans believing that Biden was not legitimately elected. So that dropped to 58%. And in a similar fall 2017 poll, 67% of Democrats believe that Trump was not legitimately elected president. Is there a pattern here that we should be concerned about? My point here is that partisan divides have eroded Americans' trust in confidence in their own democracy. And that trust is essential to its success. In that same mid-December poll, barely a majority of Democrats, barely a majority of Republicans, and barely a majority of independents said they were either very or somewhat proud of the way democracy is working in this country. Each party, barely a majority, believed that. But here's the more serious erosion. In 2002, after the 9/11 attacks, 90% of Americans were proud of their democracy. By 2013, that had fallen to 74%. By 2017, it had fallen another 10 points to 63%. And this past year saw that number drop to 54%, having a positive view of our democracy. But listen to this. Among those ages 18 to 29, 54% have a negative view of American democracy. That doesn't suggest a promising trend. Looking ahead, the poll found that 1/3 of Americans, predominantly Republicans, are not confident that their votes will be counted in 2022. And 1/3, a different 1/3, predominantly Democrats, are not confident that all eligible citizens will have the opportunity to vote. And majorities in both parties doubt that the other party will accept the election results in states they control. We apparently are losing confidence in the very fabric of our democracy. I don't care what party. Because state governments determine the voting laws in their states, and because Congress is stymied in its ability to pass new federal voting rights legislation, 2021 was a busy year in election laws, and we can expect 2022 to be just as busy. According to the Brennan Center for Justice, which has been tallying all these pieces of legislation for the past year, in 2021, 19 states passed 34 laws restricting access to voting. But 25 states enacted 62 laws expanding opportunities to vote. And you won't be surprised that by and large these break down as red states and blue states. Restrictive voting laws passed in 2021 typically impose stricter voter ID requirements, make voter registration more difficult, limit access to mail ballots, limit early voting, reduce the number of polling places, thereby increasing the number of people waiting in line at those polling places, expand discretion of state officials in purging voter rolls. Despite a number of attempts, there were no bills that passed that would enable partisan bodies to reverse election results, but we can expect more of that in 2022. Conversely, expansive voting laws, including ones that were passed by the Colorado legislature this past year, there were some of those others that didn't get through, those laws typically make it easier to request and cast a mail ballot, improve access to disabled voters, strengthen language access provisions, and expanded automatic voter registration. This is not a partisan argument, folks. I am not interested in the structural dominance of the Democratic Party any more than I am interested in the structural dominance of the Republican Party. What grieves me even more than the actual events of January 6th is the extent to which so many people refuse to see what happened, deny that they once condemned those actions, or, including many who would otherwise hold Trump responsible for those events, simply want to forget the whole thing and can't we just move on? Can't we just get along? Well, I want to get along. But to be clear, I am not interested in moving on. Not if that means ignoring the need to hold people accountable for this uniquely violent assault on our institutions. I'm not interested in moving on if that means ignoring the broader context of January 6th, which has been a persistent assault on our electoral system and a threat to the ideas that are at the center of our Constitution. If that's what moving on means, count me out. We are, strictly speaking, a republic, not a direct democracy. Our challenge is to build a system of government that is not dominated by what James Madison referred to in the Federalist Papers as factions, which he defined as, quote, a common impulse of passion or of interest adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the community, end quote. In Federalist 10, Madison warned in particular of a tyranny of the majority. A tyranny of the minority we can handle with voting. It's when it becomes a tyranny of the majority that we have a problem. a tyranny of the majority which, quote, enables that majority to sacrifice to its ruling passion or interest both the public good and the rights of other citizens. Our system rests on a foundation of checks and balances and separation of powers. Madison talked about this in Federalist 51, which I'm going to read a key paragraph from. It may be familiar to many of you. Lots of references to men, and I have replaced it with a generic word because it does apply regardless of gender. Quote, ambition must be made to counteract ambition. The interest of the person must be connected with the constitutional rights of the place. It may be a reflection on human nature that such devices should be necessary to control the abuses of government. But what is government itself but the greatest of all reflections of human nature? If people were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern people, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by people over people, the great difficulty lies in this. We must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. A dependence on the people, no doubt, is the primary control on the government. But experience has taught mankind the necessity of auxiliary precautions. End quote, the understatement of the century. 2 points are important here. First, the framers understood that human beings are flawed, driven by their individual self-interest. We cannot count on goodwill and civic virtue on the part of those who hold power, as much as we might like to encourage it. We must ensure that those in power are checked by others, whether among the separate branches of government, including the courts, between state governments and the federal government, by the institutions outside government, including a free press, all of which hold government and those in government accountable. If these measures fail, these auxiliary precautions, then as Madison predicts, power will inevitably become centralized. Second, Madison clearly does not have much faith in the people. But what if these auxiliary precautions prove inadequate? At the end of the day, civic participation in the affairs of government is essential. Civic indifference, including the substantial percentage of Americans who decline to vote even when they recognize there are issues affecting their lives on the ballot, means we abdicate our choices to those for whom power is an end in itself. In this regard, we might even have a separate side discussion about the school board elections this past year. But I'll leave that aside. What this all tells me is that we are a nation split rather evenly down the middle, with Republicans largely, but not entirely, on one side, and Democrats largely, but not entirely, on the other side, and independents split pretty evenly down the middle, leaning one way or the other. This split could be a recipe for sustaining our systems of checks and balances. However, as confidence in our democracy erodes and more people choose to opt out of the process, the chances increase that our laws will be determined by a tyranny of the majority who participate. I hope you heard Sergei Popovich when he spoke at the forum on November 14th. He noted the polarization of societies is an instrument used by autocrats to preserve their position. by diluting the center in politics. The debate is among extremes, largely about polemics and ideology rather than facts and reality. It appeals to fear, not reason. The center is where one finds nuanced arguments, a readiness to listen and understand another's point of view, and a willingness to compromise. Oh, that sounds like just peace. Certainly, on the political issues we're discussing here, there is very little in the center. We, as citizens, have to rebuild that center. We have to engage on these issues. We have to listen, understand, and be prepared to act. I still believe that January 6, 2021 is a day that will live in infamy. But apparently, in the minds of most Americans, that's not the case. January 6th is in danger of being ignored or forgotten or becoming ignorant about. Just as Americans were conveniently indifferent to the growth of Jim Crow laws after Reconstruction, conveniently indifferent to the systematic lynching that was practiced in parts of this country, conveniently indifferent to the ethnic cleansing of indigenous peoples, conveniently indifferent to spikes in anti-Asian or anti-Muslim or anti-gay sentiment during various national crises, or a host of other uncomfortable prejudices. But let's posit for a moment that we believe that America should stand for something different. And I think in this audience, I suspect that's a pretty universal view. That regardless of our flaws, and we have them, we should serve as a beacon on the hill for democracy, human rights, preservation of our threatened environment, and the dignity of every human being, regardless of whatever. That image has been severely and perhaps irreconcilably tarnished, not only in this country, but around the world. In that respect, the Gazette was absolutely right 1 year and a day ago. So what are we to do? I confess the answers that I'm about to give are going to seem common, banal, maybe even trivial. Number one, read and consume news from multiple sources. Number two, think critically about assumptions as well as asserted facts. 3, listen to others. 4, be empathic. Seek to understand others' point of view. 5, be an informed voter. 6, demand transparency and accountability in government at whatever level and on whatever level. Something you might talk to Richard Scorman about when he arrives. Because I'm not pointing a finger at him, but there are issues in this city council as well as in the U.S. Congress. Do not compartmentalize politics as something else. It's central to our lives. Be willing to stand up for what you believe. Engage in and with civic affairs in whatever way you are comfortable, and maybe a bit beyond your comfort zone. Finally, number 10, don't give up. Democracy is hard work, and we're the ones who have to do it. Thank you very much for listening to this rant. We've got some time, so I'll take some questions. I'm going to free myself from my script, so I will wander. Is there a microphone down here? Oh, you got it. Okay, then I'll stay by the microphone. Who's got a question? There it is. You're on.
I think there's going to be another one. I think there will be another attempt to do what happened.
Oh, do I think there will be another one? I fear that's a possibility. I don't see a repeat happening of January 6th. What I do think the other one will be is not a January 6th assault on the Capitol. The good news is that a lot of the organizers of that themselves are kind of going underground, arguing amongst themselves. Yeah, they got factions within their factions too, so that's good news, right? Human self-interest sometimes works in our favor. But do I think we will have wholesale challenges to election results in 2022 and 2024? Absolutely. That table has been set. The only thing that might get in the way is if the people who pursue those endeavors find themselves, totally publicly embarrassed, even amongst their own base. That's the hard part. Impoverished by lawsuits. They actually do get sued successfully, Sidney Powell and Rudy Giuliani and all the others. That they actually end up losing their wherewithal as well as their licenses and are essentially shut out. That'll help. I noted last week that what were they called? The cyber ninjas in Arizona who conducted this ridiculous audit that showed nothing are now being told they have to produce all their public records and turn them over to the county. And something like, I forgot what it was, $50,000 a day fine until they do. That's checks and balances. It's slow. But there's got to be a cost to pursuing these. So far, none of the politicians who have pursued not just the January 6th, but the whole attempt to figure out how to reverse the course of the 2020 elections in Georgia, Texas, Pennsylvania, and so on, none of those people have had to pay a price. If they don't pay a price, oh, this is fun, let's do it again. They have to pay a price. I'm not confident that's going to happen, but I'm keeping my fingers crossed. Thanks for the question. Yes?
Thank you, Sky. I've thought a lot the last several weeks, obviously, about how this has unfolded. Much of your eloquency has been rewarded, and I definitely will give you my email to send me a copy. Finding the middle has been something I've been thinking a lot about lately, and it is, to me, almost impossible is that we have two sides that are absolutely certain that their perspective is accurate and backed with facts. So we're not going to persuade, either side's not going to persuade.
The extremes will not be
facts
persuaded.
are that. So my question is, how do I find the middle with my friends who are on that perspective versus my perspective? And I think this is the challenge for all of us. We got to find a middle that's not a political middle.
Right.
I think there's been a growing aversion to the word compromise now for 30 years. Some sides, compromise is a loss, no matter how you phrase it. So reflect on that in terms of your own thinking about how I'm sure you have friends who don't see things the way you see them.
Absolutely. No, that's the gazillion-dollar question. It used to be $64,000 question. That's inflation. It's the gazillion-dollar question. And I start with, I'm not going to convince the guy down the street. I don't have one of these, but you know, if he were there, I would not convince him. Maybe he's closeted. I'm not going to convince the guy out the street who is mentally, anyway, floating a Trump won flag. You know, screw you, Trump won. You know, and you've seen those flags flying around here, various places, depending on what neighborhoods you go in. I'm not going to convince them. They're not going to listen to me. And if I were really true to myself, I guess I'd say, and I'm sure glad they're not my friends. Because I don't see how I would be friends with, but I do have friends who start from another premise. It's a premise about the role of government. It's a premise of generations of having been a Republican, and therefore the Republican Party gets the benefit of the doubt. Being conservative gets the benefit of the doubt. I refuse to believe that everybody on that side is lockstep with this narrative. I view it as a bell curve. And if you could pick off 1 or 2 or 5 or 10, then you pick off 1 or 2 or 5 or 10. It's not necessarily even persuasion, just a conversation that's, you know, where do you start and where do I start? You agree to disagree, but you be civil about it. And in the course of conversation, you find things that you agree about. I have a number of friends. I spent a military career, and where military career tends to be more conservative. It doesn't say they're Trumpers. It says they tend to be more conservative. And I socialize. I play poker with. I play golf with guys who, you know, would not agree with much of what I have to say here. For them, you know, voting for Hillary Clinton or Joe Biden would have been apocryphal. They weren't necessarily fans of Trump, but they weren't going to vote for them. So separate that out. The number of times I've gotten into a conversation when somebody says, well, what did you want me to do, vote for Hillary? I said, no, we're not going to relitigate that election. That was 5-6 years ago now. And that is one problem with our election system. At the end of the day, it's a binary choice, right? That kind of perpetuates this notion. But if you can get past about whom did you vote for and whom didn't you vote for, I find that one of the most difficult things to get people to do is to admit they were wrong. So don't require it. Where do we go from here? How do we get out of this mess? How do you see this mess? And I've had these conversations with numerous people, sometimes with good results. I can think of one guy who was way over here in terms of his instincts, still very conservative politically in many ways, but I could send in this text and he would agree with every single word. And I can think of another very close friend who I would send it to, and he would say, yeah, I agree, that's all absolutely true, but... And there would be a but. And then we'd start the conversation from there. And we've had those conversations. It's slow going. It's hard. Janet and I were talking last night, and I said, I think I'll take out all the references to First Congregational Church and Just Peace and so on, and just maybe send this to the Gazette as a guest essay. I doubt they'll publish it. In the first place, it's too long. And she said, well, why don't you send it to the Indy? And I said, well, I'll do that too. But my instincts were to send it to the Gazette because I'm more interested in getting someone to read it who isn't instinctively going to agree. So we don't just sing to the choir. That's not a very, very good answer. It's not a very helpful answer. It's like dealing with the issues that we deal with in this church, right? We sit down and talk to people, and where are you, and why are you there, and what do you see as the problems, and what do I see as the problems, and how do we move on, rather than not move on by forgetting it in the sense I was talking about it before, but how do we move forward? Do you really one thing I find agreement on is the number of people on the other side of this narrative who think they're absolutely right, and why can't we all just talk civilly with each other? Well, there's a place to start. I say it's hard. I tend to like political debates. Other people will shy away from them. I'm not going to go push myself onto somebody who doesn't want to engage, but if somebody brings up the subject, I'll be there. So that's not a very good answer, but it's the only one I have. It's hard work, but it's a just peace approach is what it is. Listening, empathic understanding, and then finding a way to move forward in something we agree about. Well, I do.
Hi, Sky, thank you very much. That was inspirational. Thinking at the time, I'm going to go back and read The Federalist, which I haven't seen since college, but I probably won't. But a friend of mine this week stopped by, whom I haven't seen for a while, and dropped off the current issue of The Atlantic. I don't know if you've seen it by any chance.
I have seen it, but I haven't read it. I do subscribe.
The cover of The Atlantic is January 6th was just practice. And
Yeah.
it's a frightening, the whole issue is stories based on that theme, and it's incredibly frightening to read.
Yeah.
And one of the concerns I have, I'm the advocacy chair for the League of Women Voters, and we've seen a huge drop-off on interest in the League, other than registering people to vote. And I see a real issue of apathy. People are so overcome with COVID, the climate crisis, which personally for me is the big one, and then this whole political thing, that they've just sort of dropped out. And how do you get people re-engaged and give them some sense that they do have some some power, and that it's important that they engage it? Because that's the thing I find most discouraging about people who I know are very intelligent, who vote consistently, but just can't seem to gather up the energy to go that extra step. And personally, I'm afraid after watching the films of the fire. I'm afraid of the climate change issues, and I'm afraid of COVID, and certainly I'm afraid of our governmental issues. So
Yeah.
find a solution. Thanks.
Yeah, that's all easy questions. No, I hear you, and you know, as you know, many of you know, I'm involved with Citizens Project, and the Citizens Project and the League of Women Voters have been partners for many years in trying to get people registered to vote. Nonpartisan, just encouraging people to vote. I don't care whom you vote for, but vote. And you can make the kind of lofty argument, and I think what part of the problem is all of the things that you mentioned, COVID, climate change, corruption in government, those are big, and I feel powerless about those. Why? What's it going to matter? And I find that using those kinds of issues to many people, I'm not saying all people, but to many people, just isn't going to persuade them to do something they're not already inclined to do. And I find that the most successful, but again, it's one-on-one, small groups, whatever it is, the most successful way to get people mobilized to go to the ballot box is because the issues are put in such a way that they personally believe that their vote can make a difference to an outcome. And I think in many respects the Republican Party has done a better job at this than the Democratic Party. Again, I'm not making a value judgment on the issues here, but just in terms of observing what's been going on for the last 20 years. I remember, in the wake of an economic collapse, it wasn't the 2008, 2009 economic collapse, maybe it was the 2008 election. Or maybe it was 2004 after, because the 2000s had so many different ups and downs. In the middle of the war in Iraq, it was the 2004 election, in the middle of the war in Iraq, a downturn in the economy, the tech boom had busted. With all of these issues, I remember watching the election outcomes in states like Ohio. And the voter numbers were up in all the places you'd expect blue counties and cities to be voting. But at the end of the day, Ohio went red. Why? because when they rolled back the curtain, found that the number of seniors who hardly ever voted before from rural counties in Ohio went to the polls. I remember thinking to myself, why in the midst of all of these issues do we have these state initiatives going on the ballot about gay marriage or abortion or whatever it was, culture issues? Because those are the issues that people were preaching from the pulpit about, which you can do without mentioning the word Republican, and mobilizing people to go to the polls to vote. What happened in the 2021 school board elections here? Voter participation went up. It still barely broke 30 or 40%. It wasn't very much. But I remember writing a piece for the Just Peace thing that said, if you believe in equity as a value, that's what's on the ballot. But people were mobilized to go vote who didn't otherwise would never vote in a school board election, and they went out and voted because they wanted to make sure people weren't teaching critical race theory. I don't know what it is, but I don't like it. But look at the outcomes in District 11, District 49, District 20. The tyranny of the majority doesn't apply to all the people. The tyranny of the majority applies to those who play the game. If you don't play in the arena, you're watching from the sidelines. So I think part of that answer, and I know you try to do this in the League and we try to do this in Citizens Project, is to get people to see that these issues, maybe local issues even more than national issues. Yeah, COVID is bad, climate change is scary, all of that stuff, but I can't affect that. But I can change what's happening in my school board. I can change local elections, and guess what? Local elections and state elections will frame the national conversation. So that's my best answer for that. How are we doing on time? You got 5 minutes?
Yeah, we have just about 5 minutes, and we have to get out on time because we're in the sanctuary now.
I can reconstitute
I think we have
over
about
there.
at least 4 people that have additional questions.
Okay, I will make short answers, and we can reconstitute out here.
I'm going to prioritize our very own city council.
Hi, this is Nancy Wyndham.
Hi, Nancy. I couldn't recognize you behind your mask.
So I'm going to give you all an opportunity to participate.
Great.
I don't know how many of you are following, but we are voting tomorrow for Richard Scorman's replacement. And if any of you live in District 3 and you care about how that's happening, I encourage you to write your city council and let them know how you feel about the process. If you don't understand what's been happening or haven't been plugged in, I'm happy to talk with you today, because it is at this level today, tomorrow, this is happening. And it's really, really important. And if you live in District 3, either write to your city council or show up tomorrow morning at 8:30 and speak before we vote. Thank you.
You're here.
Can you project the likelihood that people primarily who oppose the government right now are going to suffer natural phenomenon as a result of not being vaccinated for the coronavirus, please?
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of Darwin's rule, right? I mean, the irony, some might call it justice, but it's a tragedy no matter what, is that those who are not vaccinated, for a variety of often political and cultural and other reasons, are the ones that are hugely disproportionately suffering and dying, taking up hospital beds and all the rest of it. I mean, that's just a tragedy. I wish it would mean that people of that ilk would then say, oh, maybe I ought to reconsider. And some are. But not as many as one would have thought, not as many as one would have liked. I've lost count of the number of prominent people of that political persuasion, of that attitude about vaccines, who on their deathbed said, I was wrong, and all those people that used to listen to them, only a small fraction of them actually listened to them on that point, when you would have hoped that a whole bunch of others would. Is that going to materially change the numbers? No. But it is a tragedy. It's a sad state of affairs, but it's tragic.
Well, I think we're going to have to...
Look, we got one more. I will be quick.
If I could just add to what Nancy said. Even if you don't live in District 3, and I just spoke with her, it is important to let your city council member know, because this sets a bad precedent. And so District 3 is a district that's, in the highlight, but regardless of your city council district, let all of the council members know this sets a bad precedent. It really discounts the vote of the people. And you can email them. There's an email, and I don't know it exactly, but it's like allcouncil.some type of gov. So you email them or show up tomorrow. But if you just Google City Council website, it'll have that all council email address. It's very easy.
Yep.
So thank you.
Yeah, here, here. All right, thank you all. I'm going to go up here if anybody has to follow up with any conversation before church. But thank you all for listening, and thank you for your very difficult questions.